And now, please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, if you know anything about Mark's gospel is the action-packed gospel of the four. Matthew, Luke, and John each have long discourses where Jesus speaks. In Mark, Jesus speaks far less. It's more about doing one action, then another, then another, then another. His favorite word, at least one of them, is this Greek word euthus, which is immediately or at once. And it shows up again and again throughout the gospel. It's not always translated in the NRSV, but it's there. It's almost like maybe 80 years ago when directors were filming a movie, they'd have 3 cameras to have 3 different camera angles, and today you've got 30 different cameras for every shot. Well, that's Mark's gospel, the one with the 30 cameras going from one thing to another to another. You see, Jesus this very day that's being described, he was in the synagogue in Jerusalem, in Capernaum, where he cast out this demon from the man that we talked about last week. And then the text says immediately he goes from that next door to Peter, aka Simon's mother-in-law's house. And if you go to Capernaum, which again, I can't wait to go to Capernaum. If you go to Capernaum, the location of Peter's mother-in-law's house is marked there, and it's literally next door to the synagogue. So he literally immediately just went around the corner. Now, it's also noted, of course, this is Peter's mother-in-law, which I always smile when I see, because Peter, as we know, was the first pope. And isn't it funny that the first pope was in fact married? But I will not make this a discussion about clerical celibacy in the Catholic Church. In any event, Jesus heals Peter's mother, then she gets up, and like the angels in the wilderness, it's the same words, she served Jesus and the 4 apostles that were there with him. But then, as evening comes, word has gotten out about Jesus, and people are just thronging at the door. They're just pushing down the door so they can get there, and person after person after person gets healed. Demons get cast out. Now, we find out later in chapter 5, if you recall, when a woman who was suffering from a hemorrhage touched Jesus' cloak, Jesus knew it because power went out of him. So the assumption is all of these healings and exorcisms would have been quite exhausting. I can only imagine how exhausting it was. And then the next verse says Jesus gets up early in the morning, goes out by himself, and prays. Now that verse 35, is one that I've loved for a long time because all of us are incredibly busy. That's one thing that our society just specializes in. I mean, I honestly think that it's one thing that we pride ourselves on more than anything else is our busyness. American high schools versus, say, high schools in England. When I taught in England, I was shocked about how unbusy the students were. And I was like, you don't get it. In America, we woke up, we went to school, we went to sports, extracurriculars, homework, bed, repeat 7 days a week. You just learned how to just work all the time. You go to college, you work all the time. You go to an American university, and they give you more pages to read than you could read if you did nothing but read all week long. And then you go into a demanding job where right out of college, you're expected to work 60, 80, 100 hours a week. And then when you finally start to see some light at the end of the tunnel and are working at a job that maybe is not quite so intense, kids come along, and then you have no time. And then you talk to people who retire, and they're like, oh, I've retired, and now I'm busier in retirement than I was before. Busyness all the time. I think if there's any passage in the New Testament we can relate to, it's like, yes, busyness, yes, the need for rest. But what I find fascinating about this text as I was looking it through is that Jesus gets up, and the Greek is clear in this, Jesus gets up between 3 and 6 in the morning to go off alone. When it's still very dark, so it's probably closer to 3. This is not someone who's seeking rest. I find that remarkable. There's this sense of, when we're so tired, we're just like, oh, if I just had some rest or some vacation. But you've all had the experience of going on vacation and coming back more tired than when you left. Because again, it's one thing after another while you're on vacation. But what Jesus here does, he doesn't seek rest. In fact, he deprives himself of rest and instead seeks solitude. I find that remarkable. Here he is in the midst of his exhaustion, and the one thing he prioritizes is solitude. I mean, I'm someone who's pretty extroverted, those of you who know me. I love being around people, I love hosting people, I love doing all sorts of things with people. And yet, boy, those times of being alone are so restorative. I'm sure that's true with you too. But how often do you get time for solitude? I mean, we're surrounded by people all the time, everywhere we go, every activity we do. So often to relax, we'll watch TV or look at our phones, but that's anything but solitude. This past week, I was reading from the Trappist monk Thomas Merton. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Merton. He's one of the most famous spiritual writers of the 20th century. And Merton was, he's a Trappist monk, and so the Trappists are known for actually living in monasteries in complete silence. And Merton was writing eloquently about solitude, where he said that there are certain parts of ourselves, all of us, that we don't share with anyone else. Not our spouses, not our best friends. There's certain parts of us that we only share with God. There's certain secrets that we have. And Merton says we need to respect that in other people and let them have those secrets, just like you want that respect for yourself. That certain part of yourself that's just you. And he said it is in solitude where we get to explore what that is. Merton's like, one of the big problems in society is that we don't spend enough time in solitude, so we don't know who we are. We let who we are be defined by other people and other expectations, as opposed to who we actually are and who God made us to be. For Merton, he said that the act of true compassion is being able to recognize someone else who knows themselves. And only when you know yourself truly can you really be compassionate for other people. Otherwise, you're constantly getting demands from other people. Like, my demands need to be met because there's something in you that needs to be fed, or at least you think it does. But Merton's like, this solitude is what defines who we are and allows us to then be the people we need to be for others. But how often do we actually give ourselves that opportunity to be alone? For me, there are two places where I find solitude personally. One are in walks. I'm someone who loves going on walks. And no offense, I don't like going on walks with other people. So if you ask me, I'll be like, okay, sure, but I'd prefer to walk by myself. I love walking by myself because it's one of those times, I mean, I don't know about you, but so often if I'm sitting alone, sometimes my mind's just racing about all the things I've got to do. Or if I have negative narratives in my head, oftentimes if I'm sitting in my office, I'll just be repeating these narratives again and again in my head. But when I'm walking, after about 5 minutes or so of walking, those narratives begin to calm down, and I get those moments of solitude, of time with God, of time of introspection. I mean, I can mark a good day as a day when I've had a chance to go for a nice long walk. Another place I find solitude is in reading books. Because unlike movies, where so often things are filled in by the director and the producer, when you're reading a book, you fill that in for yourself. Books allow for your own creativity to come forward. That part that is you. You respond to the words in different ways. Each person responds to the words in different ways. And for me, that can be so restorative. I mean, reading is a solitary task. Where are the places in your life where you find solitude? So this is what Jesus does. He goes off to be alone. And then it says, he goes off to a deserted place. I find this another odd detail. Goes off to a deserted place. They could have just said, Jesus goes off, sneaks out of the house. I think of this very small house around Capernaum, and the apostles all sleeping on the floor, and Jesus like a teenager trying to sneak out, like stepping over the apostles as he goes outside at 3 a.m. He goes outside, and it could have said, the text could have said he went down by the water. The water was right there. Could have said he went to some sort of hill, but instead it says he went to a deserted place. Now the word deserted, eremos, is the same word that means wilderness, that we see where Jesus goes into the wilderness at the beginning of Mark's gospel. So he goes to a wilderness place, it says, to pray. A wild place, if you will. A place that hasn't been overly cultivated by human hands. When I was in Houston, Texas, I had a townhome, small townhome in Houston, and it had a very small garden in front. I mean, this was like 8 feet by 10 feet. Thankfully, my former roommate Peter is here, and he can attest to the fact that it was a small garden. And one of the great gifts, one of my friends was a landscaper, also came to church person, and at one point he's like, the old garden was nothing. The old front yard was nothing. He's like, I want to make as a gift to you, I want to make a nice garden at cost. Let's design this garden. And my then roommate Jacob is someone who loved things being a little bit crazy, so he's like, let's make it wild. Let's have just stuff growing everywhere. Let's shelter it in so when you walk into this garden, you feel like you're in the middle of a pulsating, thriving, sort of wild place. Now, it didn't quite work out the way Jacob wanted it to. It's a different story. But it was great when it was done, because it was this place that I went all the time to reflect on and pray. And there were chairs there, and I could sit, and I could relax, and I could feel the energy of all those plants around me. And how wonderful it was. That's the nice thing about wild places. Things that are not overly cultivated, there's a certain energy to things that are not overly cultivated that you can feel. And for me, I've always found it easier to pray in places like that than, say, anywhere else in my house in Houston. The place I wanted to go was out in that beautiful garden. When I was a little kid, we would often go up to Kennebunkport, Maine, to Goose Rocks Beach, where my grandparents had a house. And their house was at the far end of the beach. And there was a little estuary by their house. On the other side was a peninsula that was totally untouched. It was a wooded peninsula. And at low tide, my brother and sister and I could walk across the little estuary and then wander through the rocks on that peninsula. We could look at all the little tide pools that were there. But one thing that struck me so much, sitting on those rocks, looking out over the Atlantic Ocean, was just the majesty and awe of it. Dale Allison, in his book Luminous Dusk, which I mentioned months ago, talks about how one of the reasons why people are less religious today is because they're more disconnected from nature. They don't feel that wonder and awe of nature. You don't see the stars anymore. You don't see anything. Everything's so cultivated. You go from your house to your car to your office and back to your gym, which is like the least natural place you can imagine, but very necessary. But to be out in a place like that place up in Maine, and to sit on those rocks that for 2,000 years or more, thousands of years, the water has lapped against and smoothed out, and to feel the heat on those rocks, and put my little feet in a tide pool. It was just something so full of God's majesty there. So that's one of the things, like, where do you find those wild places in your life where God becomes real? There's a third aspect of this text, which is one to highlight too. Jesus goes there and it says he prays. Now, so often our prayers are sort of short prayers that we'll say as a blessing before a meal or before we go to bed. They're brief. They may be a minute long at max. But here Jesus is going to pray in the morning by himself, presumably for hours. And he's in a place of discernment. If you notice in the text, Jesus goes to Capernaum. There's all this stuff going on in Capernaum. He goes off, and his disciples try and hunt him down. The verb in Greek is literally, it's somewhat pejorative. They're really trying to hunt him down so they can find Jesus. Like, people need you. More demands on your time. Jesus could very well have, from that point on, just been the prophet of Capernaum. Spent all his time in Capernaum. There are plenty of needs there, plenty of people who needed his compassion. But sometimes you need to step away from the weeds so that you can get perspective on what's going on. And I think that's what Jesus is doing here. He's spending so much time in prayer that when you spend that kind of long duration in prayer, in meditation, in reflection, you can come to insights. You can get that distance in parts of your life that need to be resolved, and you can see a new way forward. When I was in India on my sabbatical, one of the great places I went was up to the far northern part of India, right up in the high Himalayas, a place called Leh and Ladakh. It's at 12,500 feet above sea level, literally on top of the world, surrounded by these giant mountains on every side. It's a home of one of the homes of Tibetan Buddhism. And I had so much time in prayer and reflection there, and I just felt myself just broken open and overwhelmed by the presence of God in a way that I so infrequently feel to that extent just going around my daily life. That time away in a wild place to spend a long time in prayer and reflection, and how that can change us. So Jesus gets up super early in the morning, not well rested, but alone, seeking solitude, seeking a wild place, and seeking prayer. And his ministry is changed after that. This is a message he's giving for all of us. All of you busy people, all of you overwhelmed people, if you want to carry on the ministry that God is calling you to do in your life, in all aspects of your life, in your home life, in your work life, here, and other places, if you want to be able to do that effectively, just as Jesus did, remember this one verse, Mark 1:35. Write it down even, to remind yourself of it. Just the necessity of solitude, of the wild places, of long time in prayer. It gave Jesus the connection to God and the strength to do his ministry. And if you listen to it, it just very well may do the same thing for you.